Ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America!
And now, ladies and gentlemen, your host, Tim Binnall.
No commercials, no subscriptions, no network, no rules, and at the end of the day, my friends, no comparison. Welcome to another edition of BOA The Revival. Looking forward to this week's program. We got a very interesting guest on tap for you here. He is, Reverend Redbeard. I'm a little thrown off by the name because Reverend Redbeard, what a exciting name. And I came across Reverend Redbeard through the Great Blue Sky Migration. He popped up on Blue Sky and followed me there, and immediately I was like, who is this Reverend Redbeard guy? I want to find out more about him. And I looked into his stuff, and he's the creator and host of the podcast Acadia After Dark, which discusses the darkness residing in the woods of Maine and New England. And it's a really cool show. It's really well produced. And I said to myself, I want to get this guy on Binnall of America so we can showcase his work and talk to him and find out a little more about who Reverend Redbeard is. So welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's really good. It was really... the Redbeard thing came up as actually a radio name. Because I originally, before I got into podcasting, I did radio DJing and stuff like that. So Reverend Redbeard kind of came with that territory. And I just kept with it because it rolls off the tongue, right?
It does. Well, we always start out when we have a new guest on the show, the bio, the background. Who is Reverend Redbeard? How did you get mixed up in all this? And how did Acadia After Dark come about?
Well, I guess kind of the longer version of it would be that as far as Acadia After Dark was concerned, I've always been interested in basically anything paranormal. When I was a kid, I was one of those people that was into ghosts and aliens, picking up the old copies of Weekly World News. Oh, yeah. You remember that one at the newspaper stand or whatever? Yeah, so that was me growing up, was always reading that sort of stuff. And then as I got older, I got more into broadcasting and storytelling and things like that. And Acadia After Dark is kind of one of those things where I started out with it originally just being like, I'm going to do one episode of this about a couple of things I really was interested in and wanted to talk about. And then after I did that first episode, just the research part of it kind of hooked into me, and I was like, I kind of want to just do this. And after that, I was just full bore with it, and I did the official Acadia After Dark was 10 episodes, so I basically covered 10 different subjects around Maine. Yeah. And then since then, I've already started on second season. I'm already 4 or 5 episodes deep in research on that, and it's just one of those things. But as far as where I've been, I started out originally, like I said, in broadcasting. I've actually done radio work for like WERU, which is a community nonprofit radio station up here in Maine. And when I was doing that stuff, I just I realized I enjoyed speaking and stuff like that. So I was like, well, I want to do a podcast. And there's been 2 things I've been consistently a fan of pretty much my whole life, and it's either the paranormal or wrestling. Well, you look out there, and there's a million wrestling podcasts right now, and I don't want to be one of those. So I was like, well, what's something I can do that's a little more out there and a little more creative? And Acadia After Dark spoke to me. And this area in particular, Acadia or Maine, it's honestly so rife with folklore that it was one of those things where at first I was like, oh, maybe I'll just do New England. Mm-hmm. And then within the first few episodes, I was like, I could literally do an entire podcast and like multiple seasons on just the stuff in Maine.
Right.
So since then, it's just developed where I'm like, honestly, I don't think that I'm going to need to worry about researching anything outside of Maine for the next year or two, because it's just so much stuff. And every time I come across something else, there's just more to find.
Nice. Yeah. Now, bring people up to speed, because I have family in Prince Edward Island and in the Maritimes. So I'm familiar with the Acadian people.
Sure.
And their whole story. But I think a lot of people aren't, because I kind of had to do, when I first learned about this, I did a deep dive into it and kind of came to understand who the Acadian people were. Because originally I thought they were like Native Americans, and it's like, no, these are people who came from France and
yes.
were horribly mistreated by the Canadians. So,
it's a very weird,
those Canadians. Yeah. But tell us the story of the Acadians. Yeah.
So when it comes to that, it's like, this area is a melting pot of many different cultures. Before, as you were saying, some French settlers came over here. It was originally Wabanaki territory. And then when the French settlers came over, and in fact, some of my descendants were even coming down from Canada at the time. And as you said, they didn't have the best of treatments in those times for a lot of people and a lot of reasons. But unfortunately, that being said, when it came to everybody coming to Acadia, it's interesting to see how the folklore and the history of the area has developed so much since then. Because it's only been in the recent years, really, that some of this stuff has been getting rediscovered. Like a lot of the Wabanaki history and stuff like that was kind of like my school in the area, because we had a lot of a high density, like indigenous population. There was a lot of people in my school. So we actually discussed a lot of their folklore and things like that early on. But because we also have that Acadian history, and we're literally right next door to the official Acadia, it was just kind of a secondary history that we were all absorbing as part of like local history, we used to call it. So a lot of those folk stories and things like that came from that are taught to a lot of people around here. It's just for some reason or another, it doesn't seem to have left this area.
Yeah.
And that's
crazy.
One thing I thought was really funny about it, because I talked to people about this and they're like, what do you mean? Like, anytime I bring up Maine in general, it's never Acadia. It's always discussing mainly like Stephen King. If I bring up anything to do with Maine, the first thing that other people are like, oh, so it's like all ghosts and werewolves up there, right? Because that's what Stephen King writes about. And I'm like, well, yeah, but not all of that. Like,
So I guess give us, but because people don't know, kind of give us the thumbnail. Who were the Acadians that, that you're right near Acadia? What is this? People don't, I'm telling you, like, people don't know, have never heard of this. I'm telling you, it's crazy.
Well, my show covers more of their history. As far as the Acadians were a French colony that came here in the 17th, 18th century. And most of them inhabited North America and Canada, like over to Nova Scotia. So they, of course, brought over, part of their history was the Northern European histories. Yeah. But it also mixed here. And we, oddly enough, have the same kind of cultural roots as Cajuns. Like, we have like a high density Cajun sort of, even you hear some in my accent up here. Yeah. So the thing with, when they came over here originally and then like began to settle in with the Wabanaki people, there was definitely a little turmoil in the area, obviously. And that preceded the actual colonization of Acadia, because Acadia didn't become Acadia as we know it today, as like Maine, until the late 1800s, when it was incorporated, I think in the 1860s or something like that. So the early Acadians that came over from France, went down through Canada, and then spread out through this region, they basically brought in a lot of their history, a lot of their stories, and that's what I really try and focus on.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So, and my biggest one that I enjoy, because the lore of the Northern Europeans is really interesting, and I like reflecting on how that compares, and then how it was altered between the way the Europeans would tell a story and then the way when it came to North America, it was kind of retold.
Yeah.
So you'll have some older stories, like things like stories of banshees, which aren't necessarily a French thing, but because of all the different populations of people that came over from Europe and they melted here, we ended up with our own variations of that. To which here we would call it a Kawakwa, is essentially the same. It uses basically took a Wabanaki legend of what we would look at as a Wendigo and then mixed it with like a Northern European history and then created its own story. And that's the stuff that I really like to focus on in the show.
Yeah.
Because the way that stories are told and passed down through generations has always been really interesting to me. And we don't have the same way of telling stories today. So when I can see that there's like a direct line of, oh, this story relates to this one that I heard retold. And even locally, we have our own stories. And I'm sure, you know, wherever you are, you probably have the same local folklore. But here is so like, it's ancient. It's, you know, 400 or 500 years old, right? It's from the 1700s. So at this point, we're kind of looking at, you know, several centuries of folklore and stories from all these different groups of people. You have the Acadians that came here, then you have the French, you know, settlers that came from Canada, then you have the indigenous tribes, then you have other people that came up from the South that ended up mingling in. And all of them had their own stories. And it's just crazy because I don't really see that in some other areas. So I always like checking out that stuff. And that's been pretty much what my show is focused on mostly.
Yeah, there you go. Well, let's talk about, I picked out some of the highlights from the show here to talk about a little bit. This is interesting because it's another story I don't think a lot of people are too familiar with. We've run the photo at Coast to Coast a few times, the Buck Memorial.
Yes.
This is a really interesting case. So tell people about this. I didn't realize it was in Maine. I'm in Boston, just outside of Boston. So I get into Maine every once and again when I'm traveling or I'm going up to see Lauren at his museum or one of his events or something. But so I'm fairly familiar with Maine. But I never realized that the Buck Memorial was even in Maine. So I was surprised to see that featured on your show. So tell us about this.
Yeah, that one's a fun one. That's an old story that I picked up. I mean, years ago, living very locally to that, every time you drive by it, you know, when you're a kid, somebody's got a story of it. And so I heard all the different interpretations of it as I was growing up and things like that. So when I was doing Acadia After Dark, I knew that was going to be one of the first episodes that I wanted to do. And at the time that I was starting to write for the show, we were having a local festival in Bucksport they call Ghostport. And it's basically the tourist trap version of Halloween Town, where they, like, because of all the local ghost stories and stuff, they just really play it up. Yeah. And, you know, so I knew I wanted to do something around that. And the Buck Monument is the first story that comes to me, like, mind when you think of Bucksport. So that story is basically that there was this monument, and it's right visible on Main Street. You drive through town, there's one main road through town. You cannot miss it. It's there. So the story goes that back in they originally used to say it was the 1600s. Well, if you know anything about history, Maine wasn't doing anything of the sort back in the 1600s. So the old story was that basically in the witch burning era, as they would call it, Salem witch trials, supposedly there was a preacher, justice of the peace, that had an affair with this woman, and kind of as a vengeance for, you know, her threatening to turn him over or something like that, he basically called her in as a witch, to which then she was burnt. Well, then, as the story is told, she put a curse on him that was going to be that her mark she would be under her foot, or her mark would be forever on his grave. Different variations of it, depending on who you're talking to, right? So, lo and behold, she is burned. Years later, he passes away. We're talking 60 years down the road that he's passed away. They build a monument in the Maine town cemetery in his honor. And a few years after it's been built and erected, big stone monument, it's good 6 feet tall probably. All of a sudden there's this black mark on the middle of it that admittedly looks like a foot. Looks like an old stocking, you know? And as the story went, they tried to remove it. They tried to scrub it off. They tried to take the, stone down. And supposedly it kept coming back no matter what they did. Which is a cool story. And it's pretty much as soon as you do the surface level research into it is where you already notice the fallacies there, right?
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Is like, unfortunately, I like to tell stories, but then the more you look into them, you start to realize that a lot of them don't hold water historically. Yeah. So the problem with this one mainly being that we didn't have witch trials in Maine.
Yeah.
Like, you can just know that that's not a part of Maine's history because we weren't part of that, United States at the time. 1600s, Maine was barely settled. It was mostly trees.
Yeah.
So off the, cuff, you can already dismiss it and be like, well, obviously that's not going to be that. But the story itself has been retold and stretched so many times that it's obscured any of the real need for facts. And the Historical Society has like a plaque right next to the monument that says the full story.
Yeah.
I never heard that story as the way it's true, and who Jonathan Buck, the actual colonel, was. I've never heard anything about what the monument was originally for, anything like that, until I started doing research for the piece. Because the local folklore and the story around it has just kind of overtaken it in every aspect. Interesting. And yeah, and now the entire town, like I said, yearly they have like a whole festival around it, the whole area takes part in it. They have a ghost fort. They have a haunted fort up the road, like an actual haunted fort. They have like coffin races they do down through the town and all this stuff. So they've kind of like really done the whole thing to just like ramp up the tourism around this.
Yeah. When is this? I want to go. I want to go check this out.
It's usually in October. It's a blast. All honestly, right. They have a ton of stuff. No, you definitely would. That was, ironically enough, the first year I went to that was when I met Lauren Coleman for the first time.
Oh, wow.
Because he happened to be doing a seminar at like a paranormal festival that was going on that same weekend. Oh, cool. So I ran into him, and he's a wicked nice guy, though he shattered my dreams of the chupacabra. Because he pretty quickly, when he was asking people what their favorite cryptid was, or their favorite mythological creature, I was like, chupacabra. He just started laughing. I was like, oh, geez, that's not good. Wicked nice guy, though. It was really cool. But the whole festival there is just, it's something that if you've ever been from a small town, you'll see those weird little things that crop up there where they kind of make their own things. Like Point Pleasant did that with, the Mothman is a good example.
Right. That's what Exeter's doing down in New Hampshire.
Sure. We do that across the country. And that's part of the cool thing of American folklore and American mythology, is that we have the ability to do that. And Maine does this a lot. Like, we have several towns that have done this at this point, where they just have these little like festivals or these weird little stories that become their own personal identity in a way.
Gotcha. So what is the true story of this thing? Because there's definitely a weird boot mark on there. There's no denying that. That's for sure. Like,
yeah. So basically, the boot is, so the stone is a particular type of granite, and this is where it gets a little like, it's a little disappointing when you hear how like kind of bland it is that it's a particular type of granite and any granite, when you work with it, it has a chance of there being imperfections that won't show up in the stone until years after the fact. And oftentimes when you have granite that is left out in the elements, the iron in it will oxidize and it'll cause different marks to show up. This one is like a really weird one. It's kind of a case of pareidolia, right? Because we're seeing something because we're identifying it as a boot. But that's just a random mark that happened to appear. The true story, though, is, and this is straight from the Historical Society, the stone has never been replaced. They've never once tried to replace it. The scraping the stone would never do anything because this is just a mark that is a part of the stone, right? So unless you just take the whole monument down, you're never going to get rid of it. So unfortunately, the whole story kind of was just a big, it was a weird coincidence. But that's what it was a coincidence. Now, as far as the identity of the woman, never been able to come up with an actual name for her. She was misidentified for a while as an actual real true crime case that happened that went unsolved back in the late 1800s. And people went around calling it this name. And when I heard it, I was like, well, that's weird. Come to find out, that was actually a completely unrelated case that happened in Bucksport probably 40 years after the stone was erected.
Oh, wow.
Somehow this random woman's name got attached to this whole legend and stayed that way for 100 and some odd years after some guy out in like Iowa told the story in a newspaper.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, so when I tracked down the story, that's where it actually originated. It started in Bucksport, didn't get published until some random guy halfway across the country wrote about it in a newspaper. And then it's been proliferated to a point that this entire town has made a whole festival around it. It's just wild to me how these things happen,
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
But the unfortunate woman that was part of it is actually going to be one of the episodes I'm going to be covering in the next season because her story was actually way crazier than the tombstone was. I was really weirded out by the whole thing. So when I started doing more research into it, I found it's a lot of weird stuff up here, man.
All right. That'll be in the next season. Okay. Now, one of the... Another story I wanted to ask you about, because you got some stuff on there that I'd never heard of, and that's the Palmyra Werewolves.
Oh,
this is a really weird story. And then I was looking on the thing, and I Googled Palmyra Werewolves, because I never heard of this. And it's all these sort of little things where people are hey, have you ever heard of this case? Or has anyone ever heard of this Palmyra Werewolves case? Something with wolves and stuff. And so it's a weird sort of on the periphery urban legend or story. I don't know what it is really, because I wanted to wait till I talk to you. But what is this? What is the story here with the Palmyra Werewolves?
So basically, this is a story that happened back in, if I remember off the top of my head, I want to say it was 2009, 2008, somewhere in there, right?
Yeah.
So
not too long.
Not that long. It's relatively recent. The people involved still live locally, but they've just stayed out of the public eye because the story got well known through the show Paranormal Witness, if you've ever seen that back in the day. Yeah. They did an episode where they covered it on there, and I guess the family wasn't exactly happy of their retelling of the story.
Yeah.
So they kind of after that just shut themselves off and didn't really want to talk or discuss it with anybody after that, is my understanding, because these people they're just average people. The man, Eric, he works in a mill. He's not a guy that's looking for attention. This is not a dude that wanted to be on the internet, be a celebrity on TV and stuff like that. Okay. Yeah. So basically what happened was they moved to this property after he got injured, laid off from work. They were behind on bills and stuff, so they needed to find something that was a little more affordable with their, routine. So they move out to Palmyra, which is a pretty rural, small town. I'm not saying it's out in the sticks. It's like farmland, okay? Yeah. So they move out there. They find this nice little ranch, beautiful property. For a while, people weren't able to identify where this house actually was, and I was able to find the location. And it's a beautiful place, but it's very secluded, right? You're in the middle of, there's like one road that goes by, and then you're surrounded by just a field and then trees on all sides.
Yeah.
So they move out to this property, and pretty much almost as soon as they move in, they start having weird experiences. Like seeing things like lights out on the tree line, seeing like, there was one instance where their daughter was out walking their dogs, and she finds this really weird big hole dug out underneath like some trees and brush. It looked like something was like sleeping in it. Yeah. So the whole family kind of just dismisses this stuff for the most part. Eric and his son, Sean, they both were hunters and stuff. He had a bunch of guns. He was not worried about like, oh, if there's a predator around here, he's figuring a coyote or a bear. Not that worried about it, okay? So supposedly, and this is according to every testimony that they gave, and the family is the like only witnesses in this entire thing. So it's 4 people involved.
Yeah.
Supposedly, Memorial Day weekend, and this is back in 2008, like I said, they had an experience where just after they went outside to, sit on their porch, they're watching the yard, they're just kind of enjoying the evening. This is August. It's a nice time of year to be outside. All of a sudden, they see something moving across their field coming towards them. And Eric, he's, pretty quick to like get up and be like, well, that's weird. What would that be? Thinking it's a person walking across their field. Okay.
Right.
So he stands up and he's looking out across this field. And according to his wife, he pretty much immediately tells her, just get inside. To which she does that. She just turns around and runs inside. Yeah. Don't blame her, because honestly, like, if somebody shouts at you, you're just having a good time drinking your coffee, and somebody shouts at you, get inside, usually you're thinking there's a good reason for it, right?
Yeah.
So
The smart, unless you're in a horror movie, the smart thing is to go inside. You don't stick around and go, hey, why? Why do you need me to go inside? It's like, something serious is happening here. You better get inside and, hunker down.
It's one thing that lends credibility to this whole thing for me, and a lot of these stories is like when the people actually act the way that you think people should act.
Right.
I would not be messing around and being like, oh, well, what is it, honey? But she did the right thing. She goes inside. He comes in behind her and basically immediately starts locking doors, closing the windows and everything. And according to them, they look out through their windows and they're able to see these dark shapes moving around just outside of the light. And they have like a security light that overlooks the back half of the yard, but in the front half, they basically just have their porch light.
Okay.
It's a pretty long. Yeah. It is just as the sun went down. So I'd say probably about 8. And they said it was around 10. That might have been a little late. I'm thinking it was probably like earlier than that they were actually outside. But the way they reported it was about 10 at night.
Okay.
So they're sitting there. They see this. They go inside. They're looking out and they can see these shapes just moving around and just outside of their light, where they can't really get a good fix of what they are.
Yeah.
But they see 5 of them. And whatever they are, they're big. We don't have wolves up here, or at least not like a population of them. Sometimes they might move through from Canada going through towards the lakes, but that's it. So the next thing would be like a bear, but you're not going to have 5 bears that are just going to like come up to your house, right?
Yeah, unless it's a cartoon.
I'd hope not. That would be a nightmare in itself. But they basically, at this point, he's like, okay, we've got to do something, because they're all just right outside of their front door, basically. His wife according to him, his wife had a problem with his gun collection. So he had to keep it all out in his barn.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, which if you see the property, they have two barns. They have their house, which is like a little like two-story house. Off to one side, they have a large like livestock barn. And then on the other side, they have like a little smaller storage shed looking barn. That's where his guns were.
Oh, shit.
So he's adamant that he needs to go get his guns. She's telling him, no, don't. It's not worth it. Like, call the cops. So they call the police. And the police are basically like, there's not anything we can do. There's one of us out here, and they're not equipped to do with anything about this. We can call animal control, but they're not going to answer until the morning. We're talking rural Maine. So that's not surprising, unfortunately, that you have like counties where it's like you have like 4 police officers for an entire county.
Yeah, and it's a holiday too, so it's like, you got the one guy who got stuck working on Memorial Day,
Yeah, he literally answers the phone and he's like, there's nothing I can do for you, sorry.
Yeah.
Which is a horrible response, but that's kind of what I would expect. So at this point, Eric's like, nope, we got to get the guns. He tries. He does. He leaves the house. He tries to go out through the back door to walk across. Well, at this point, the things have been just circling the house, supposedly. Just going just outside of where the light would be in the shadows, according to them. Well, when he goes to walk out the back, the security light flips on. And that's when he actually got to see one of these things. And what he reported is what I describe as a werewolf in appearance, but I guess some people would call it a dog man.
Yeah.
And it was basically, he said, about 6 to 7 feet tall, hairy, with a human-like body, with like bent knees, like a dog's legs, how they have the reverse knee.
Yeah.
He said that it walked like that, but it was much more muscular. Like it had like a developed chest and arms. He didn't say anything about if it had hands, but the face was fully canine, he said. They looked like wolves. And at that point, he sees that there's more of them. He can see their eyes, and he can see the one that's in the light. Well, that immediately like backs out of the light, to which he turns tail, runs back to the house. At that point, he's like, no. He goes back inside, and they start grabbing anything that they can think to grab. Sticks, I think they had some tools and stuff that they had inside of their mudroom or whatever. They started grabbing those, hoping if they have a shovel or something, at least they can beat something away if it tries to break in a window, right?
Right.
Well, they have a teenage daughter. She's about 17 at the time, and she slept through almost all of this. They go up to her room and wake her up, and they tell her, like, come to our room, we're going to hide in there because there's something going on. Horrible idea to wake up your teenage daughter like that, I guess, but she goes with him. She's trusting, and he's called his son to come over, but his son is several miles away, so he's not able to get there. At the time that they went upstairs, these things have been just circling around the bottom floor of the house. They go into the bedroom, and I don't know if it was that they heard them go in or if they flipped on the light or what, but somehow or another, the things apparently knew they were up in that room.
Yeah.
Because that's when they decided to climb up the side of the house onto their overhang porch, which is like, if you can imagine the front of a house, and then you know how you'll have those little balconies that kind of aren't really balconies, but it's just a little ledge of the roof, the lip. So basically they climbed up over that to where they were able to get onto the roof of the house. And then they could hear them just digging at the tiles of the house.
Oh, fuck.
Trying to get through the roof to get down to where they were in the room. Which, I've lived in Maine my entire life. I do not know a single animal that would do that. Nothing. Nothing.
Yeah.
There's just no reason a normal animal would want to do this. They immediately freak out. Eric's like, I've got to get the guns. I don't have a choice. We've got to get the guns. He tries again, this time going out the front of the house, hoping he can get to his truck to then back over to it.
It's clever.
That's what I thought. I was like, this guy is actually trying. Again, the multiple attempts, this is what people would actually do. I'm like, this guy sounds credible to me. But unfortunately, he did not have the the best of luck, because apparently as he got to the truck, the security light kicked on again, which shows all of these things exactly where he is.
Right, right.
They all start running. He says he hears them running across the roof and coming right towards him, to which he immediately runs back inside, slams the door.
Shit.
Yeah. And at this point, basically, they were like, we're talking 2, 3 in the morning. They're terrified. They just go into their room, and they literally just all huddled in a corner with their 2 dogs in the corner of the room, and just listen to these things on the roof for the next couple of hours until the sun came up. The whole time, not being able to do anything about it. They basically were like just hoping that nothing got in. And then the next morning, just as soon as the sun came up, supposedly stopped. Just immediately silent. They were all gone.
Yeah.
They all went outside. They found tiles that were torn off of the roof. They found like chunks of wood that was torn up on the door frames and stuff like that. Jesus. Footprints all around the mud of the property and things like that. But when they finally like tried to go and report it, basically the sheriff's office was just like, there's nothing we can do. We have animals out here. It must have been coyotes, must have been bears, must have been this, must have been that. Yeah. And it all got blown off. But the weird thing about this whole story to me is, you talk to people in the area, they've said that that property had weird stuff about it long before these people lived there, and ever since. This was not like a one-off occurrence. I kind of call it, I was joking, but I kind of call it like the Maine version of the Skinwalker Ranch.
I was thinking that, yeah, when you're saying that, yeah.
The lights, the weird animals, the strange, like, you know, they were talking about like ghost voices and stuff in the house in one, you know, part of another person's like testimony that lived on the property. They were saying the house itself is haunted, that they hear voices, they hear children like laughing and stuff when they're in the house.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is not just one isolated story at that case. And even the people in the surrounding neighborhood have said, oh yeah, there's weird lights in the woods over there. To which I'm like, okay, so it's obviously a little more than just the werewolf story that everybody has heard. And that was kind of what drew me to it, because originally I was like, well, the werewolf thing is weird because we have Dogman up here. Like the Turner Beast is another well-known story in the area. It's right up the road from that. Yeah. And so like Dogmen and werewolves are relatively common in Maine folklore, but it's not very common that we hear like the combination of different elements of the stories, right? So that one was a weird one, and I still don't fully know how much of it is to be believed, because the only witnesses to the entire thing were the family, who seemed credible enough, but there were no pictures. You would think in 2008, most people had a pretty decent digital camera at least.
Yeah, you would at least. Well, what were the footprints like?
Well, that's another thing, is they claim that the footprints were just like scrapes in the mud, but they were like too big to be a dog or a wolf. And I'm like, well, if there's footprints, take a picture of the footprint, right?
Right, that's what I mean. Yeah. And how you say they've kind of gone underground, so to speak, because this TV show did a thing about them and they weren't too thrilled about it, presumably.
Yeah.
But how did this story even come out in the first place? Because I don't remember hearing this, and I've been in the scene now for 20 years, and this is like, you know, well after I had gotten mixed up in all this, and I had never heard this Palmyra story at all. So where did it even come out and kind of get out there?
That's another really weird thing about this, is that the first account I can find of anybody talking about this was that Paranormal Witness episode.
Weird.
So just came out of nowhere. But since then, it's been covered by tons of people. there's like a bunch of larger, like, YouTubers and stuff that have covered it. Like Mr. Ballin, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He did a long video about it where he was actually one of the ones that kind of got it going on Reddit to where people were starting to actually look into the case more and finding some of the information. But as far as like any actual accounts, there's nothing in the newspapers locally about it. There's nothing in like the local, records, like as far as the police haven't talked about it. They don't have a 911 record of it, things like that, which makes me think it's not what it appears, or if it wasn't when it was said to be. Because if that was something that happened this soon, or this recently, it would have been everywhere. I mean, think of when they got that one picture. They had the one picture of that dog man down in Texas outside of a fence, and that went like viral within minutes and was everywhere. So I don't think something like this would have just popped up out of nowhere. And here, my newspapers, they cover a goose like blocking traffic on Main Street once. Like, there's literally no reason that they wouldn't have covered a story of a family being held hostage by literal werewolves, So
very interesting.
Very good story, but under scrutiny, I'm still like very skeptical. But the stuff around the property is like sounds more legit than the werewolf story. Like, there's a long history of people seeing weird stuff at that property. I just don't know how much of the actual wolves I believe of the whole situation, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna want to dig into this more myself later. Have you tried to contact the family at all? It'd be interesting to see.
I did, and I hit a wall. I hit a wall trying to find them. Where I got to was where, what was her name? Shelley, I believe, had changed her name. I don't know if they had separated or divorced or whatever, but that's kind of where I hit the wall, was when people changed names. And then I wasn't able to find anything after that. And they have no social media presences. That's another weird thing. Like, nowadays, everybody has a Facebook, right? It's just so weird to me when you just don't have any record of people. And especially when there are people that are like in a small area like this, you would be able to find somebody that knows somebody.
Right. Yeah. I'm fascinated here. So in the show, I like, as you were saying this, I put it down. I put Paranormal Witness in my notes. I'm like, look into this. So, but I'm just going to ask you. So were they on the show as like recounting their experiences?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They were on the show, and they've, since then, basically after that, as what I've been able to gather, they went on the show. They did recount a bunch of their experiences, but I guess they didn't like the way that, sci-fi kind of sci-fi'd it and then played it up more than what they said. I guess specifically, like, Eric was more adamant that they were animals and not, but at the same time, it's pretty weird to have a bunch of animals that will like circle your cabin or your house.
Yeah.
And, like stuff like that. But despite that, the way that it sounded to me was that this family, whether they were, there long term or not, I think they were only there for a few years, because pretty much as soon as this whole thing happened, they moved out. We're telling the story already after they've moved out and settled elsewhere. So little to no possibility of being able to go back and say, hey, verify this, because it's already kind of been passed off to, 7 other people that have rented the place since then. I did find one guy that rented it, and he was on the radio talking about it for a while, and he was one of the ones that gave me the source of the ghosts and stuff in the house, and that one was pretty interesting.
Okay, yeah, because the other thing, I don't know how much I'd recommend this. I recommend that you do this, because I'm not going to do it. So I'd recommend maybe you drive out there and knock on the door of the property and be like, find out who's there now, and be like, is anything weird happen here? Can I look around the fucking roof area to see? Because part of me also wonders, with all due respect to this family, who I have no idea who they are, if maybe this whole thing was just fucking made up by sci-fi, by the TV show. What if you're like, we want 3 actors, they're going to play a family, they're going to live, we'll pick up, a remote town in Maine, and we'll make up this story, and fucking it'll be. It's real. I don't know if because there's a reality TV kind of thing going on here. It could.
I mean that would be a
sci-fi.
Exactly, that would be a very sci-fi thing to do, and that's like part of why I was very skeptical about it. Is because when I got to the point, I'm like, I can't even find the police records of it at all. If they got a phone call from a family saying, "Hey, we're being attacked by wolves," there's going to be some record of that.
Right, in 2009 or whatever, 2008. Yeah.
Again, if this happened in the friggin' 80s, I would have been like, yeah, par for the course around here. I would have totally understood it. But in the 2000s, that was not the case anymore. So maybe very skeptical on it, but it's an interesting enough story that ultimately I was like, I aim to tell a good story. Right. Even if I find out that like it's explainable, I'm going to tell the story first. And then if we want to get into the nitty gritty and you want to know the facts of it, well, there are facts usually. I like finding out that stuff, and sometimes it disappoints me because it's like, you get really interested in something. The more you're digging into it, the more you kind of unravel it for yourself. You peek behind the curtain a little too much.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the boot on the tombstone there. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, though. Yeah, that makes me think. If someone, pressed me, I'd be like, right now I lean toward like that fucking just made it all up on Paranormal Witness. I don't know. Yeah, it's just, or two, where you mentioned that the first time it ever came out was this TV show, makes me super fucking skeptical. Like, they could have just made it up out of whole cloth and been like, who gives a fuck? It's a great story. This will be cool. People will freak people out. They kind of, they like, it's sort of like a reimagining of the Kelly Hopkinsville story in a way. It's pretty much kind of very, very similar in a sense to that story. They're like, well, what if we do one that's like werewolves? It's like Kelly Hopkinsville, but it's like werewolves, and it's in where's the creepy place? Maine, because Stephen King's there. Yeah, Maine. It'll be in a little town in Maine. You can't. And they're like, all right, awesome. Find me fucking 3 actors, and we're gonna make this show. Like, I would totally believe it.
And honestly, like that is 100% what I would take away from this, because based off of all the evidence, that's what I'm seeing.
Especially because you said, have these people done any subsequent interviews or appearances? Like,
not a damn thing. They did one. They did one radio piece where they talked briefly, but it was basically just to be like, yeah, that wasn't like really the whole story or the way we wanted to, have it portrayed. Wasn't really giving any more details on it. It was just kind of saying Paranormal Witness was, what it was. But aside from that, the whole thing with that, story originally when it came out, I don't know how long it was between when the episode of Paranormal Witness came out and then it like kind of got known on the internet.
Yeah.
So there was a bunch of like interpretations of it already by the time that it made its way back to me. Yeah. And one of the weirder ones was that for some reason there was this whole idea that people had made that, oh, well, this whole story was actually, this other state. And I was like, well, that is possible because like you said, it's easy for somebody to take another story, copy paste, here you go, and then say, oh, it's this creepy ass place out in the middle of nowhere, because who the hell is going to be able to verify any of that shit? Yeah. And just pass it off as their own. And now it's been, 15 years since this whole thing happened. The people involved, whether they're a legit family or they were just 3 random people they found to read lines, moved on, haven't, as far as I know, come back out of the woodworks to say anything about it. Yeah, it's all pretty sus there. But I do still want to actually go to the property now that I found it, because that was the one thing that came out of my research on it that I was very interested in, was that when I actually found the property, I was like, oh, so it is a real place. This is not just, they just made up a place. Okay, there was an actual identifiable location. So that was where I was like, okay, maybe there's a little more to this. And then finding the, stories locally about it, I was like,
interesting.
Okay, no werewolves in those stories, but still interesting stuff. Because I just like anything that's paranormal out there. I'm going to be like, well, may not be werewolves, but it's still, ghost lights in the woods. That's something I can check out. So,
yeah, exactly. One of the things I love about Maine, we've talked about this with other guests in the past, Mainers, and is the Specter Moose. I love this because it's such a very Maine. It's such a very Maine fucking legend in a way. It's really cool. This is like a ghostly moose that people see on occasion.
Yeah. It started out as like a very physical, like real, like just a large white moose. Then over the years, the story of it developed to where it became like an ethereal thing and more of a spectral entity. Yeah. But yeah, it's just, you can't get much more Maine than that as far as when you're talking about mythological creatures. I think that it's like pretty high in the rankings of like, if you're looking, I was joking recently and I was like, I think the only way you could have it be more Maine is if it was a lobster. Because
yeah.
And it feels like there would have been one of those too at this point. Honestly, living around here, I'm surprised that nobody's just done that just for the sake of having the cryptotourism kind of, be like, oh, come and see the 14-foot lobster or whatever. But yeah, the Specter Moose, that's one of those ones that when I first heard it locally, it sounds silly, right? Because in a way, it's a moose. Until you see how big a moose is in real life.
And then crazy.
Yeah. And then you imagine that, but like twice the fucking size.
Right.
And then you're like, okay, yeah, that's something. And legitimately being around here, we do have like albino deer, albino moose. It does happen. And it's a real thing. So that's one of those like, that's one of those mythological creatures that I think definitely could have some validity to it. Of course, it's exaggerated, because it's gonna be. It's not probably gonna be a 15-foot tall moose. If it was, holy shit, that's fucking giant. Right. But if it's not, it's still a white moose. Is still something that might as well be a goddamn unicorn when it comes down to it, because they're so friggin' rare. Right. So it's one of those cryptids that I think we could friggin' look at and be like, well, it's a mythological creature because of the whole spectral entity of it. But then at the same time, we know this exists. We do have these things. They're like, it's just not, it doesn't evaporate into the fog and stuff like the stories tell. But it can look that way, right? Like
it can. And if you're, and if you, let's say you're out somewhere and you stumble upon a fucking albino moose, chances are, I mean, they can be aggressive, but they could also, I imagine it would freak out the albino moose and it would just take off into the fucking woods or whatever, so that it could have that ghostly, where it's like, I was looking at it, I turned my head for a second and it vanished. It's like, yeah, dude, it ran into the fucking woods. It's an albino moose. Yeah. It's like probably super timid because it knows. It's like, it knows when it's been spotted. It's used to being, it can't be camouflaged. I assume they don't last really that long in and of itself unless you're a really tough albino moose, because you're like, I guess, I don't know what really would attack a moose anyway. A Bigfoot, maybe. That's about it.
I was going to say a Bigfoot would be probably one of his prime predators, I'd say. But no, we do have like coyotes around here, which can go after moose, but not usually a full-grown like male moose is not going to have a predator around here. Every once in a while, a really brave bear will try it, but that doesn't usually work for them. Because we up here, we have black bears, and they're not the most intimidating things. They're more likely to run. That being said, though, the moose are kind of like, they are pretty elusive creatures up here anyways. They, I lived here 38 years. I've seen 2 moose in my entire life.
Oh, wow.
So they're not that common as it is. So imagine that, and then try and see like a white one on top of that.
Yeah, it's incredibly rare. Yeah.
We're one of the most forested states. We're going to probably have more of those like likelihoods that, if somebody did see it, most of these animals are going to be more likely to run the opposite way. It would make perfect sense to me if somebody, especially back in the 1800s, some guy did see a white moose. It took off running into the woods. Pretty easy assumption to make after that. And you see where the story definitely develops
Exactly.
from there. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like,
Because I assume, like, we know albinism, but, like, and maybe I'm selling short our ancestors, so I apologize if I am. But if, like, some dude in the 1800s or whatever, or 1700s, like, stumbled upon an albino moose, they may not know what about albinism. So they might actually be like, that's a fucking ghost moose. That's a fucking ghost moose. Like, what else could it be? There's no other explanation, you know? So
100%, yeah.
Then it becomes ghost moose.
Absolutely. And the whole thing with this, the way that the story developed after like the first like 40 years, you know, because this is back in the 1860s that the first one was being seen, right? Within 30 to 40 years, you know, the original moose would have died off.
Yeah.
So there would have to be obviously the descendants that people are still seeing, or they're just continuing to propagate the same story, except now it's a real ghost moose in their minds. And honestly, back then, with the way that they were about hunting and stuff like that, I think more often than not, probably the first time that most of them saw a moose in the first place, they probably shit a brick.
Yeah.
Because they're a terrifying fucking animal. They're huge. They're one of the biggest things you can see in the woods up here. So absolutely, if they saw one and it was a white one, they're going to think that's a forest deity or something like that. I know I would today, and I know what the thing is. If I came across that in the woods, I'd just thank my lucky stars that it was my lucky day, and then I would hightail it. Because what the hell else are you going to do?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a later story about it where it got really wild in the whole legend, where you can tell where the legend definitely just went off to a whole other like level, where it was no longer just people hunting in the woods and then exaggerating it. It was more like now it's become a real mythological creature. And that was the story that happened in Ashland. So in that story, supposedly these hunters had shot an albino moose, took it back to their camp, were dressing it out for the night, but it got too late. They basically were like, well, we'll finish it in the morning. Left the thing hung up, went to bed. The following morning they get up, the moose is gone. So you're talking a good 1,500 pound moose that was hanging, just took off. Animals wouldn't be able to drag something that away. So even if it was, they would have figured they would have been around. They search all over this area. They can't find it. All they find is a little bit of blood pretty much right where they've been working on it the night before. Otherwise, not a trace. That night, after they spent the whole day out looking around for it, they're sitting around the campfire. All of a sudden, they hear a sound, and this moose just comes trotting back up to the camp. Just walks right up to it. Apparently his throat's still cut, bleeding.
Jesus.
Right. So they proceed to turn around and shoot it again. Honest response, you know. But they shoot at it again, and supposedly the bullets just passed through it this time. Didn't do a thing. And the moose just looked at him, turned, walked away silently. Didn't make a noise, just walked off.
Yeah.
Following day, still no trace of the moose. So they all just pack up their stuff and they leave. About a week later, in another town about 30 miles away, this moose, supposedly seen just walking around with a fully cut open neck, just walking around down by a riverbank, to which somebody tried to shoot at the thing again. And it just walked off into the woods and then never got seen again.
Weird.
And at that point, I'm like, this is where the story's really, really gotten interesting, because it's like you have a real basis to it where it just takes this impossible leap to the fantastical.
Yeah.
And it's like, at what point did the story, you know, get here? You know, at first it was, you can see just an albino moose, maybe a particularly large one. But then when you get to the point that now the thing's impervious to bullets, now the thing is like fully just able to just disappear at will.
Right. Now it's a ghost moose. Yeah.
Right. And that's how the story just developed from 100 years of retelling, essentially.
Yeah.
You're talking 1800s, mid 1800s to the mid 1900s. Which mid 1900s is, it's not that far off, honestly. People knew what a moose looked like then. So those stories being retold at this point, I'm like, well, what the hell are these people talking about? Like the ones back in the 1800s, I kind of get it. People in 1950 that are still like, I saw it. I'm like, what are they doing?
Well, maybe part of it too is if you back then they didn't know maybe that it was an albino moose, but like 100 years later in the 1960s, like it was more well known. It could have been an albino moose. So you have to almost take the story to like another level where it's like, yeah, it could have been an albino moose, but wait, here's why it isn't, because now it's a fucking ghost moose. I think maybe that's kind of how it developed into, because otherwise people would just be like, yeah, it's an albino moose, dude, relax. You just saw it. I mean, it's cool you saw one, but it wasn't anything paranormal. And they're like, no, you don't understand this, but I shot at it, right? I tried to hit it with my car and I went right through it or something like that. The story gets kind of like they have to add an extra element of weirdness to it.
That's true, and funny enough, that was actually another of the stories that did come up about the Specter Moose, was talking about somebody who claimed to have hit it with their car.
Yeah.
Now, that one was a weird one to me, because this was a relatively recent one, and there's a thing with moose. If you're in a car and you're driving at night, your headlights are actually pretty low to the ground. So a moose, a lot of times,
it's above
your headlights.
Yeah, you just see like the little stick legs. So you're
exactly,
and then fucking boom. Then the top of your car gets fucking crushed.
Which is exactly what fucking happened. And this person basically was like, oh, well, it was actually it was a ghost moose because they didn't see the moose. And it ran off because their little fucking Honda Prius didn't do anything to this goddamn behemoth of an animal they hit. And so their immediate response is like, oh, it must have been the Specter Moose. It must have been a ghost moose. And it's like, no, you hit a fucking animal that's now probably out in the woods with a broken leg somewhere, and your fucking car is totaled, and you're just going to be lucky that you survive.
Right.
Because these things, honestly, as I was saying before, people don't really realize how large a moose is naturally. So then to imagine these people that were like, oh, well, it's actually 15 feet tall and they exaggerate all these gigantic things. That stuff is just so overdone to the point that now we could just say, okay, the original white 12-foot tall moose was already insane. Then we go all this other stuff, and now people actually still to this day believe this stuff. There's a town not far off from here that basically some of the people in the town saw an albino moose, said it was a Specter Moose. A few weeks later, the town's only restaurant burns to the ground just overnight. Exactly. That's straight up how superstitious these towns are. They hear that and they're like, oh, it was the ghost moose. And it's like, okay, I'm sure the fire inspectors would probably have other opinions on this, but yep, we'll go with the ghost moose. We'll say that's good enough.
Interesting. And then, give it time and they'll have a ghost moose festival. So
I'm surprised we don't, honestly, at this point. Up near the Allagash could really use something like that. They need some good tourism up there. They don't have much of it nowadays. It used to be very popular for hunting. Now it's just people just aren't as into it as they used to. We've got a lot more restrictions on it now, so kind of makes it harder.
Yeah. Well, people, I think, and we're talking to a national, there's been all America listeners all over the country and all over the world. So it's that's why I like talking about some of these local parts of my world to try and convey to people Maine is fucking massive. It's really quite big. And it's, as you said, it's all largely forested. It's one of those places where someone's I would believe Bigfoot could be in Maine. Just because there's so much territory where it could probably be that it would be unbothered, essentially.
Honestly, yeah, it's one of those states that, like, because of the low population density and the higher amount of, like, just nature parks, reserves, forested areas, I think we're at, like, something like 80% forestation, like, regrowth since the, like, industrial period started. So we're one of the, like, few states that's really, like, just allowed it to grow in. And if you look at that, it does make sense to why a lot of those stories kind of end up happening here. But it's odd because we don't have a ton of, like, Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings in Maine, which you would think, yeah, you would think we would. And I have my theories as to why we don't, but it's also always been really strange to me because you have some states that are very similar geographically, and they have tons and tons and tons of reports. Then you look at Maine, which you would think would be just like Bigfoot Central, and we have almost none in the most recent years. Like, I think we've had like 2 since 2020 or something like that. Yeah, it's incredibly low. But then we went through this whole period in the, like, 1900s where there was just a rash of sightings of people saying that there were wild men or Bigfoot. And I think it's just like a different thing of, like, how people classify them. But we also have, like, legends of other things up here that are Bigfoot or Sasquatch adjacent, to the point that I'm like, those legends were just like that. Like, we have something that they call the agropelter. It's an old legend that the lumberjacks have told since literally, like, the colonial period. And it's basically a smaller version of a Sasquatch that hangs out in trees and throws rocks and sticks at people. They're just a really agitated small primate that supposedly just throws sticks at stuff at people to drive them out of their territory and everything like that. And I'm like, well, that's, to me, sounds like just this small Sasquatch, because we've all heard stories. Sasquatch.
So what's your theory? Is that your theory? Why there aren't? You said you had a theory as to why there aren't so many sightings. I
have a few. Mainly the one that I kind of think makes it is a not very fun one, unfortunately, is I just think that a lot of the people in Maine are tending to dismiss a lot of the stuff that we would look at and we would be like, oh, well, that's like a Bigfoot related thing.
Yeah.
And talking to locals, they're much more dismissive of that, and they'll be like, oh, it's a bear and things like that, which is kind of the opposite of what you see in some of these other areas.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do think, because there's like a very devoted Bigfoot community up here, like people that are very interested and research it.
Yeah.
But even they don't have a ton of reports. And I honestly, and this is going off of the basis of if, like, the Bigfoot or Sasquatch is like an actual animal, okay?
Yeah.
I think the main reason that we're not seeing that is because when you look at the population of Maine and where we're spread out, there's like this entire swath of the state that has essentially nobody there.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, because the Bigfoot, right? They would know. They'd be like, 50 miles away is this thing, but the remaining huge swath behind us, no one's going to fucking come here. So just don't, don't go to the forbidden zone, and you're fucking cool here in the giant part of Maine. And who the fuck goes out into that part? But I guess, wilderness people and survivalists and hunters, I suppose, right?
Yeah. And those people, I mean, those people, when you talk to them, they go out there, they're going to pretty much be out there for a reason. They're going to be out there usually hunting. They're not going to be out there looking around for, they're not going to be looking for signs of what you or I, and somebody that's like looking for Sasquatch is going to be looking for anyways. But even if they were, they're doing this in a way that if we're talking about Sasquatch as like an animal, it's going to be intelligent enough to know and recognize to avoid that. And this is probably the easiest scenario to where they could do that, and it wouldn't even be difficult. The state is massive. There's so many like different areas that just pockets of like forest where it's so dense that you possibly couldn't go there.
Yeah.
You have to be flown in. In like parts of like up by the Allagash and stuff, to this day, you still have to have private jets to get there, or private planes to land you on a lake so that you can go to that location.
Right,
so in those places, you're never going to know something is out there, and nobody that lives out there is going to report that shit.
Yeah.
There was one guy I remember hearing an interview with not that long ago who was talking about how he lived out there for 30 some odd years, and he heard things that would just come out of the woods and hang out outside of his house. He never said a thing about it. Didn't tell anybody about it. Just thought they were just like out there talking. But and I'm like, this is the way these people are just so dismissive of it. Is they're just like, oh, it's just another type of people or something like that. And I'm like, you do realize other people might be interested in hearing about your nightly conversations with a Sasquatch, right?
Yeah.
But well, you all at the same time, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, because a lot of these people are also, because they're very secluded, they're very eccentric. And so you're going to hear weird shit from them.
Okay, I got you. Yeah. Well, I would stop you on this. You say dismissive. I don't think they're dismissive of it so much as like not affected by it. Like they're just out there and they're like, okay, this is normal. It's not paranormal to them. I don't know. It's really weird.
Yeah,
I
suppose I see your point there. Yeah, that might make a little more sense, honestly. Yeah,
because when you say that, you make it sound like they're shitting on the Bigfoot. It's like, no, I think they're just kind of like, yeah, that's Bigfoot. They're up here in the woods, and I don't fuck with them. They don't fuck with me. And because if there's a Bigfoot, we're talking about these huge swaths of lit. Yeah, like a Bigfoot would hear the people coming before the fucking people knew the Bigfoot was there. So if the Bigfoot's like a mile away and he's like, he smells some shit, he hears some shit, he's like, all right, there's something coming. I'm going to fucking, go and get close and take a look.
They're
and it's like, all right, people. Right, exactly. So the Bigfoot's either going to be like, well, I'm not going to fucking, I'm out of here. Either I know what these things are, these humans are, or fucking, I don't know what they are, but they look like bad news, and I'm not gonna start a fight with them because I'm like an animal, and it seems like animals, So I can totally see that situation.
That's essentially the same argument I make for the big cats in Maine too. Like, I'm a pretty avid believer that we still have cougars or some version of large cat here in Maine, aside from the lynx and fishers.
I don't know if you know Jean Tewksbury's work, but she's been chronicling the Maine big cats for a while.
No, I will have to look into her. Actually, I was just researching that recently and only dived into a little bit of it, but I'll definitely look her up. That would be a very good source to have, because honestly, that's one of the biggest things that I've said about them as well. Is I'm like, it's kind of at this point it would seem foolish to not think that they're here, because of just the amount of reports that we've had and knowing the geographical location. It would be very weird if we didn't have them. We have stuff like, we've had instances where like numerous people credibly reported them, and then the state officials would essentially just blow it off and be like, oh, they're just passing through to Canada. It's like, okay, I understand that on occasion, but then at a certain point, it's like, when do we decide we have a living population? And I've said before, honestly, if there was never going to be a reason for them to acknowledge large cats in Maine, the pushes that they've made for like the way that regulations and stuff in Maine have been in the last 20 years has shown me that they're never going to admit to having eastern cougars in Maine, because that would ruin so much of the forest like industry up here.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
never do it. Yeah. Too much money involved with that I'm like, I just look at it, and I'm not particularly conspiracy minded, but I'm like, that's one of those ones that's so obvious and tangible that it doesn't even feel like a conspiracy anymore. It just feels like it's kind of just not being said.
Yeah, that was good.
So many people have been just like, I cannot tell you the amount of people I talk to on a day-to-day basis about this stuff that live in Maine and are like, oh yeah, I see a cougar, this time, this date, this location, and like, we'll explain it to you to a T. It's not as if, oh, I might have. It's, I definitely know they're here. Why doesn't anybody admit it? And I feel like that's kind of one of these things that Bigfoot could be that. We just haven't gotten there with our understanding of whatever they are. I would like there to be something like Bigfoot in the Maine woods. That would be awesome, but I don't know what it is. Because I don't know if it's a large primate. I don't know if it's something we're misidentifying as a large primate. I don't know enough about it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, when we had Gene on the show back in the summertime, somebody in the YouTube comments said pretty much kind of what you're saying, where it's like if they acknowledge the big cats, then people might come after the big cats. Then they would have to institute all kinds of like protections and shit for these big cats, and probably like they don't want the work. They don't want to upend the apple cart of what's going on in Maine just for these rarely seen or, somewhat now frequently seen, but still fairly elusive animals that presumably like live in the forests of Maine. It's just kind of like, you know what, let's just leave well enough alone and not fucking, again, upset the apple cart. I think that's, and it is sort of conspiratorial, but it's also like human nature in a way. You can kind of see where they'd be like, yeah, we don't want to even go there, Oh, for sure. And to be fair, there is a justification to that too, because it's like I know how that they are stretched thin in a lot of these states. Like they have barely enough animal control officers and game wardens to go around as it is. So then you add something like that as like a protected species into the equation. Nobody has the budget. Nobody has the time to initiate anything on that. Even when it comes to things like around here that we already know and have established, there are known nuisances like black bears, for instance. We don't have enough resources to do anything about them to actually be able to mitigate the issue. So a cougar, that's way out there for them. You know what I mean? Right.
We just had that whole thing in the last couple of years because they've made bear trapping up here it's basically, it used to be that if you were able to deal with, if you had like a homestead or something like that, and you had bear problems or animal problems in general, you were usually able to deal with it. Nowadays, they've made it to the point that where it's harder and harder to do anything. Even if you try and call a game warden, more often than not, they're like, oh, we just don't have anybody to send out there. We don't have live traps. We don't have anybody that can come deal with this. So then you're left on your own. And a lot of people are just like, at this point, they don't know what to do. They don't have any way of dealing with that. And it's going to be one of those things when you have a cougar or a mountain lion or something like that, and that's part of your like known animal population around here, they'd never be able to get a handle on it. It's just way beyond that.
Yeah. Uh-oh. Cat's causing trouble back there.
Yeah, I hear them fighting over something. It must be
it's all this cougar talk. Yeah.
I think it's getting wound up there.
So let's talk a little bit, because this is another one of these cases that is really well known in New England. I'll confess that I'm not well versed in it, but I've heard people kind of, I think up at Exeter one time, I think one of the guys from the Allagash case was there. It's one of the more famous UFO abduction cases in the lore of the alien lore, if you will. And again, this is Allagash up in Maine. You mentioned Allagash a few times, and I think anyone who's familiar with UFOs, that'll ring a bell. Oh, Allagash. Yeah. But if you're from around here, it's one of the more famous UFO abduction cases around, maybe only to Betty and Barney Hill, of course. But talk about the Allagash incident, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was one that, honestly, when I first got into like paranormal research and like even heard the first time I heard of like alien abductions and stuff like that, that was one of the first ones that I heard of. Right. So we're talking probably 30 some odd years ago. This was one of the first alien abductions I ever read about. And
because it's from around where you are. So it's like, it's the one that, everyone loves their own hometown cases and shit in their home area. So I could see where it's like, we got our own alien abduction case and it's pretty fucking huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because it does, every time it does draw that same comparison to the Hill case. It's very well known. And the thing with it is that over time, the more information came out about it, the kind of the more the story developed. And there's still parts of it that are very interesting. So people that weren't familiar with the story, basically this group of 4 friends, all pretty active outdoors people, all went up to the Allagash, which is the waterway in the northern territory of Maine. And they basically were planning on going up there for like a fishing, canoeing weekend. And when they got there, they had a bunch of like just weird things happen over the course of the first couple of nights. Like the first day they got there, just out of nowhere, this really, really bad torrential wind just like absolutely grounded them pretty much as soon as they tried to get their boats in the water.
Yeah.
And they ended up staying for like 2 days in their first camping spot, where they met this other like group of campers that were basically in the same area, and it apparently lost like 2 of their like teenage, like, I don't know if they were family members or what. They were just part of their group.
Okay.
So essentially they were helping them out. And while they're helping them to try and find them, this is while the wind is still blowing. They thought they were out on the pond or out like on the other side. So they're looking for them. They're flashing lights out across the water, trying to see if they can get a reflection of the boat, if they can see them flashing the light back maybe. And at this point, they see lights out over the water that are just, they're hovering. They're up over the water, over the tree line, just hovering in the air. And then pretty much as soon as they would point them out, the lights would just disappear. This went on the first day that they were at this spot, and they kind of just didn't know what to make of it. Then the following day, the winds had stopped enough. They all get in their boats. They decide, okay, we're going to head to our main camping spot, which is a little further up the waterway. And the map for it is kind of hard to explain, but basically there's like a series of little islands as you're traveling the Allagash water system. There's a series of little islands along the way. And they stopped on one of these little islands, which is like a little inlet that is just adjacent to another smaller river that runs off of it. Well, they stop there, they make their camp, and after they set up their camp, probably just before sundown, it's like we're talking 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, and they take their canoes, they go across the small portion of the river to this other little inlet where they were doing some fishing. As they're fishing, they report that they see a light come up out of the trees. It sends out like a tractor beam, not really a tractor beam, but they described it as like a beam of light that followed them to where their boat was located. The light, when it hit them, they were trying to like paddle away from it or to like, get away from it. They pretty quickly were like, we're not going to be able to outrun a light that's just searching for us on the water.
Yeah. You're pretty fun.
Yeah. So it hits them. The next thing they know, they're back at their original campsite.
The original one, not the one on the
original one. The one that they had unpacked all of their stuff at just before going to fish. Supposedly they're back at this campsite, okay? Now, they don't remember anything about what happened during this time. According to them, they pretty much immediately were like, we're really tired. We don't know what happened. All of our stuff is still here, so just go to bed, and we'll figure it out in the morning.
Okay.
Next morning, they all get up, and not a one of them can recall anything of the events that happened the night before. They don't recall anything that happened from the time that they left the campsite to go fishing to the time that they went to bed. And they go on about the rest of their fishing trip. They were there like another 4 days, I think, after that. It was either 4 or 5 days. They went, had a good trip. Nothing else weird apparently happened the rest of this trip. It wasn't until like they get home, they're heading back from their trip. They stop and they're explaining this story to like I don't know if it was a game warden or a park ranger. And essentially the ranger was like, oh, we've heard, people say, they see lights out there and stuff like that. And there are like old Wabanaki legends of like ghost lights over the Allagash. So this is like, I kind of assume that that's what he was relating to. Nonetheless, they pass on, they go all home, they all split up, go their separate ways. Years later, something had happened, and I want to say it was to Jack. So there was his twin brothers. One of them had a work injury where he ended up apparently hitting his head.
Yeah.
Somehow or another, when he was put on some sort of it was a medication that was meant to help with like seizures.
Yeah.
Supposedly this like gave him some really vivid nightmares, and he started just having these night terrors just consistently, just night after night after night. His wife, not realizing this was something like specific, like assuming this was something just specific to him and his health conditions, basically brought it up to his brother one day. Come to find out, his brother, who had no medical issues, was having the exact same dreams. And that's when they started to kind of question what it was that was happening. And apparently at this point is when it kind of spiraled after that, and the timeline of events gets a little fuzzy. From my understanding of it, they were contacted then by, who was it who wrote the book? I gotta find it. They were contacted pretty much immediately by a couple of experts, and one of them brought him in and wanted them to undergo like regressive hypnosis.
Okay, what year was this again?
I want to say it was in the 70s.
Okay,
Let me
all right.
find. Yeah, it was. Yeah, so this is in 1976. Okay.
Okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I just need to refresh.
No, it's fine. I just had to pull up my notes real quick.
Yeah,
it's been a minute. Yeah. So on that one, it was, who was it that ended up doing the actual? I'm trying to find his name because he wrote a book on the entire event. And where is it? Yeah, Raymond E. Fowler. Okay. So
Raymond Fowler.
Yeah. So he's well known in the ufology community, and like he's wrote and done plenty of literature, obviously. But this was one of those books that I think people just don't understand how much of an impact this made on the way that UFO reporting is done, because he kind of set the standard, because he had not only like direct witness interviews and stuff in the book, he was able to do this whole investigation and cataloged it all in this work. And it's, what was the name? Abduction on the Allagash, I believe is the name. Yeah, the Allagash Abductions, Undeniable Evidence of Alien Intervention. And so he was the one that pushed for them to undergo the hypnosis. And supposedly, all of the men separately reported essentially similar experiences when put under hypnosis.
Yeah.
They described being picked up by some sort of like a silvery glowing orb that then transported them to what they said was like an operating room sort of deal. And they gave some pretty intense details as to what the experiments and stuff that they said that they were undergoing were.
Yeah.
And all of them supposedly were pretty consistent with a lot of the same details. They might have had minor differentiations in like the time frame of things, but most of them, they had the same basic structure to the story. Okay.
Yeah.
Then after that, apparently they pretty much like, when the story came out originally, apparently they had a lot of questions. It went through the media. There was a lot of attention on it, but they also kind of got ostracized for it. Mm-hmm. I can't remember which one of them it was, but one of the men had basically, like, his boss found out about the interview he did for some news station, and then essentially like pink slipped in the following Monday when he saw the interview, because he just didn't like the look of it for their business.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the experience a lot of these guys supposedly had with this whole thing for the majority of their lives. Their friends, their families, their coworkers just kind of dismissed them and just
Right.
They wanted to either discredit it or they pretended like it was just like nothing. So this went on until like later on in their lives when all of a sudden now talking about UFOs and ufology is now not as taboo, and you can actually like go and do conventions and stuff like that. And all of a sudden these guys who went 20 years of being told that they're crazy all of a sudden are like the people that you want to be getting interviews with and that you want to see at these conventions, which is good, but it's also like kind of odd because a lot of people pointed to that as being like, look, that means that they were just telling the story to get attention. And I'm like, well, they had their lives essentially ruined for like a couple of decades before that.
Right.
So I guess, hindsight 2020, I'd say they were playing a long con if that was their goal, is to have everybody mock them for 20 years just to get to do some convention circuits. But
People really misunderstand the glamorousness of the UFO circuit. Folks.
Yeah,
They seem to think that you're whisked away in a fucking limousine or something and brought to a 5-star hotel. Folks, it ain't like that in the UFO circuit.
That's been one thing lately, especially because, you see these ones that they end up on the news and stuff like that nowadays. And I'm like, I know that still seems like it's like a thing, but it's not like news gigs are paying very much when you're just the random guy that they point to say this is the expert. And I don't know, there's been a real shift in the culture, but nonetheless, the guys were able to do that stuff. But that's where like one of the weirder developments came out. And this was one that was pretty new to me in reinvestigating the case. Yeah. Was that in 2016, Chuck, so one of the main ones that even said that he was the one that pointed out the craft the first night, claims that the entire thing was made up.
Oh boy. When did he claim this?
2016. He did an interview where he says that he went along with the narrative for financial gain, quote, which I'm like, what financial gain? I'm like, what did you guys get? I mean, I'm not saying that he's like, I don't know what to think of this, but listen, I don't see that these guys like got stardom and fame for this story. There was a book written about him in the 80s that then like resulted in a few movies. It's not like they were getting royalties and stuff for like all of this stuff. Right. So I don't know what financial gains people were thinking he was getting from it, but he claims that the actual abduction part of it never happened. His story is that they exaggerated the time frame of everything. So they saw the light went away, then they just went back to camp and had a normal night. Which, I mean, but the other three guys all still stick to their original story.
Interesting. Wow.
So you kind of look at two sides of this, right? You can say after 40 some odd years of being told, one thing, this guy's finally like, you know what, enough, I'm tired of this. I don't want to be in this. Just get me out of it. So that's what he says. Or the flip side of they did all make it up and this is just the end culmination of all that. It seems weird, the timing, though, because it's like we're talking 30 some odd years. Yeah. Right? So 2016, yeah, it'd be 40 years.
40 years, yeah.
Yeah. So going all this time before you now come out and say, like, oh, that part of this whole thing was a hoax, which, granted, is the most sensational part of it.
It's hard to get into the mind of this guy. I assume he's still alive.
Yeah, they are still alive currently. All four are.
Because it's like maybe, let's assume they were like in their 20s or 30s when this happened. So it's been 50 years now. So like they're getting up in age. Maybe the guy's like, I don't want my name associated with this crazy story when I die. Whether it's true or not, that's up for us to speculate upon. I'll have to dig more into this guy's sort of coming out as a hoaxer. What interests me, and this might be a red herring, if we're going to take the story at face value, right? Though,
sure.
If we take, I don't know if you've considered this, or maybe there's more information here where it's like, oh, I'm a fucking clown for even tripping my mind up on this. But when I hear the story, the part about the two people who show up and the missing kids. To me, that just smacks of like this high strangeness there, dude. There's high strangeness there. Like, were these the fucking aliens sizing them up to see what if these were ideal candidates for whatever they were going to do to them? Were the fucking teenagers taken too? Were these actual were these real people who were like, hey, our teenagers are missing. Can you help us? Because I assume I was kind of waiting to see if this connected in a way. So they help the let's just say parents, for lack of a better term. So they help the parents look for the teenagers. Then they just go on their way, right? That party didn't continue on with them to the abduction.
No. Right. Supposedly they basically separated after that second day. They found the kids, which I say kids. I say kids. They were like 18, 19. So
they did find them though.
They supposedly did find them,
okay.
But then that's like pretty much where they just separated and went their other ways. And I'm like, it seemed really weird to me too. That's why I bring it up every time that I tell the story, and I even put it in my piece on it, because that is one of those moments that I'm like, it's a little too coincidental, and it does evoke that feeling of high strangeness, where it is like, why would this family have happened to be there in this incredibly remote place? They had to be like flown there. Yeah. To get to where they were just going to camp. You had to have a jet or a plane take you and drop you off there. This is not something that somebody could just take a Sunday hike with the kids and go to do. So just the idea that they even happened in this one time to have come across 4 people out there, let alone have it be in the middle of a storm that came out of apparently nowhere.
Yeah.
With people missing.
With the missing,
Then to turn around, have the light event, then the subsequent event the following day. Yeah, there's a few too many coincidences that either... I mean, if I were to just dismiss like one part of this entire thing, I would say probably like if they were to exaggerate any part of it, it would have been the whole idea of like the kids missing. But that's one thing that has stayed consistent in every like account that I've heard from that.
Yeah.
I haven't found any identification as to who this family might have been, though.
That would have been huge. Yeah. Yeah.
Because that would be cool. Because honestly, that's the only other thing that I try to look up when I'm finding stuff like this is I always try and find out, okay, if they came across these other people, who might these other people have been? Yeah. But you're talking, the 70s, there's literally like, there wasn't that many people in Maine in general, and it wasn't as much of a tourist destination to go out to the Allagash with your like teenage sons back then. So I'm assuming that it's pretty slim odds that they would have just come across this random family out there.
Very weird. Yeah.
It seemed weird. It's one of those things that sticks out, and it's one of those ones that, honestly, if they are lying about this entire thing or exaggerating the abduction sequence, which granted is like the most talked about part of this whole thing, right? Because when I hear stories told of this, the light is usually not the emphasis of the story. It's the fact these 4 guys were abducted, the hypnosis aspects, the stories that they told as a result of it. Which, if that's the part that they exaggerated and that's the part that they told, that's kind of, it's a big part of the story, but there's still a lot of weird stuff that did apparently happen in relation to that, short of them getting abducted, that I think is worth looking at. Because we have a lot of stuff like that if you just look at the one story, okay, we could say this part of it can be dismissed, but there's still a lot of weird events that go around this that we can't really out of hand just ignore.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I was looking into it just now while we were talking about it. It was 1993 that Ray Fowler wrote the book.
93. Okay. I was thinking it was late 80s, but yeah, 93 sounds right.
Nowadays, the 90s feel like the 80s, so it's all started blending together in a scary way. Pre-century, right?
It really does, honestly, and it's just getting worse.
Oh, I know that. Believe me. Now, you're not a genuine reverend, right? In case I need.
No, I am actually an ordained minister. I am actually, I can do baptisms, funerals, and weddings. I am an actual ordained minister. I did it basically as it was partially to help out some friends and partially just as a joke, because at the time I was like, well, how hard could it be to like do this? And it was remarkably easy. I actually did it like within the course of like a week, got all the paperwork filed and everything. And yeah, it's just a fun little thing to throw on.
Nice. Yeah, no, I've heard of that sort of thing. Yeah, I've been meaning to do that myself. Yeah.
I figured if it ever the need arises, then it's cool to at least be able to throw that out there as, hey, you have a wedding going on? I know the guy,
Yeah, you're like on a plane and it's going down. And they're like, is there a minister on board? We want to get married before we hit the mountain.
Exactly. The litmus test. Exactly. The litmus test for the doctor was a little too high, so I went for the next best thing.
Oh my God, yeah.
But
the justice of the peace office is closed. With how are we going to pull off this wedding?
Exactly.
Rolling in.
Yeah, we don't have the shotgun weddings like we used to, It's like, but every once in a while, you never know what could come up. Always be prepared.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
Honestly, around here we're pretty coastal, and like the amount of boat christenings, you would be surprised.
Oh yeah.
Like it's a big thing here still, because even people from out of state, they buy boats, they store them here, and they need somebody to do that. So there's always a market.
I'm going to throw you a curveball. You may have no idea about any of this, but this is one of those like Reddit rabbit holes I went down.
Okay, I like those.
You mentioned this, so maybe you would know something about this. But I heard like if you want to rename a boat, you have to go through like an elaborate process and a whole fucking like series of rituals and shit. And that maybe culminates with Reverend Redbeard coming out and christening the newly named boat. But like, if you don't follow the fucking steps, like you're dooming the boat to tragedy or something. Does any of this ring a bell?
There's a lot of that sort of stuff, and a lot of that is like regional and every place has their own traditions when it comes to this stuff. But yeah, like when it comes to if you have a boat that changes owners. If it's there are a lot of reasons that people would want to, and as far as like the actual like work they have to do, like as far as like paperwork to registering it, I don't know that stuff, but I do know that when they go to do,
I'm talking about like the lore. I'm talking about
the lore of it. Yeah, so again, where like a lot of Northern European traditions made their way here, and we just kind of adopted them. So that stuff is like still very important, especially with the fishing communities, and because that stuff, if you haven't had your boat christened, you're going to have bad fishing, you're going to have bad business, you're going to have, it's still such an intrinsical part of so much of the culture here that's still, even though the people only do it kind of, it is just a tradition. They might not believe the superstition of it anymore. They do still like go through the practices because, I mean, hey, when you see the price of a boat and you see how much you're potentially losing, you're like, I'm not taking any chances of that.
Yeah, better safe than sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, another weird one that we have up here that like just came back in the last couple of years, and this is a strange, just another like weird Reddit rabbit hole, is Viking funerals. That's now legal. We're now legal again in Maine. Like so if you ever,
I know how I'm going out.
You want to go?
Fuck yeah,
we do those again. That's fully legal as of 2022. We're now able to do that. So it's just one of those things. Like our culture up here is so weirdly diverse, and it just comes from all over, and it's still like very superstitious, but at the same time, it's localized to the point that you don't hear some of these stories like everywhere else. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You might have retellings of certain stories that we have up here. Like we have like Lady in White, like ghosts and stuff like that. You'll always hear like the archetypal like Lady in White. We have 4 of those within like a 30-minute drive of me. It's just that type of an area where there's so many stories that it's just become part of the entire region.
Yeah.
And it's part of what I love about it, honestly, because I spent so much time growing up around it, hearing these stories, and then now getting to retell them and like learn more about them, and then add context to them that they never had when I was coming up. And I was just hearing like my grandmother telling me a story about a witch's foot on a tombstone. I never knew anything about that other stuff, but now here it is, 30 years later, and getting to learn so much more about it and then tell other people about it is wicked cool. And I hope other people do enjoy hearing it too, because it's one of those things that like I know when I was, growing up, or when I'm just like reading and learning about things, I love folklore. I love hearing stories. I love hearing stories retold. So it's one of those things that I hope that people still keep that, because we have better ways of telling stories now than we ever did before. And when you have like, you can have a YouTube channel, or you can have a podcast, or you can have a radio show, or you can have a, this or that, to be able to convey all these different stories. It's such a different thing from what it was 20, 30 years ago, right? Because it used to be you pick up a book at the library. That was it. Like that was your way of hearing this sort of stuff. Now you've got a podcast that goes out around the world. You've got, things like Coast to Coast on the radio that, even though radio is not as big of a thing as it was, there's still that presence there. Oh, and these stories are still being told, and people are still discussing it. And that's so cool to me.
Yeah, it's awesome. And what I like about you, from our conversation tonight, is that you're not sort of trying to peddle this stuff. You're willing to sort of turn over the rock here and be like, wait, hold on now. Here's why this story doesn't quite fucking add up. Like, I like that. Yeah. You're an honest dealer, and I really respect that.
Yeah, that's one thing of this, and like it's a fine line, because it's like I said, I do like to tell a story. I want to tell the story, but I also want people to have the context for the story, because in some of these instances, the context is kind of what makes the story, right? Yeah. If we have other, other things I talked about on the show this past season, that was like one of the oldest ghost stories in the country took place in Maine. And it's like probably the most insane ghost story you're ever going to read. Hardly anybody has ever heard of it. And the whole thing, you read the ghost story, you're going to say, this is almost too much to believe. And it is. But at the same time, when you look at the historical context and everything that was going on at the time, and you see the way that it actually relates to the culture of the time, it almost makes the story seem more real. And we have this weird, like, fine line of that, where it's like, I want to tell people what the reality of a situation is. The witch's foot, the tombstone, buck monument there. The story itself is gratifying. So sometimes when you do hear that, like, well, it's not actually what it appears, it does kind of make you go, not as fun. But then when you see that, like, despite that, it still managed to have such cultural relevance here. Yeah. It almost makes it a little more interesting to me that despite the fact of it, it still is a legend that persisted for 200 some odd years, right?
Yeah, and people are like, they want to suspend disbelief in a way. There's a yearning for that kind of magic in a sense. It's it's sort of, they're like, yeah, it could be, but let's just fucking kind of go along with it because it's awesome that that's our part of our cultural history or whatever, Right.
And what I do is, like, it's a little too easy, especially with the research and stuff. It's a little too easy to go down the historical rabbit holes and go to where you almost get to a historical true crime sort of thing, because it's like almost every one of these cases, there's somewhere in the research that I come across an unrelated cold case
Oh, weird.
If I wanted to start just a podcast on just cold cases in Maine, that could absolutely be a thing. But I've made it a point to where I'm like, that's gonna be only like completely like secondary to anything. If I'm talking about something, I want it to be the fun, spooky stuff. I don't want to get into what's happening with like this random case that we've been sitting on for 30 years and then having to interview police, you know?
Yeah.
So it's one of those things. And there's a lot of facts that I like to try and find the basis to. And then I'll get at a certain point that I'm like, okay, is this really going to tell a better story? Or is this just going to be like, okay, this is just history now?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, you kind of like got to draw the line where it's like, all right, I ventured too far off of folklore and into just like kind of history stuff that's not really the impetus here of Acadia After Dark. Now, before I let you go, I got to ask, because I'm a huge wrestling fan. So tell me a little bit about your fandom. How long because when you said when you said about the you start a paranormal podcast or a wrestling podcast. It's like wrestling podcast. I hate to break it to you, but there's also a million fucking paranormal podcasts nowadays too.
That's fair. That's fair. I guess the communities that I've been initiated into were a little more on the wrestling stuff, because I've been tuned into that, and that's a very online community, especially nowadays. Yeah, so like I've been, it's one of those things. I literally grew up on wrestling. Like my grandfather was like showing me Dusty Rhodes matches back in the day, right?
Nice.
Like George the Animal Steel, Dusty Rhodes, Rick Rude, people like that, okay? And then like one of my earliest like wrestling memories was seeing Rick Rude wrestling in a gymnasium in West Palm Beach, Florida.
Oh, wow.
Which you hear that nowadays, if you're an old wrestling fan, that probably sounds crazy, but it's one of those things that like just at the time it was a thing. And I grew up just loving the stuff, and even for a while wanted to get into doing it, but I was like, it's one of those things. Back in the day, there was always this stigma attached to like if you're a wrestling fan, you know. Yeah. Nowadays, though, it is. But that's the thing is like nowadays,
they've both gotten cool. It's very weird.
Exactly, and that's a wild thing. Is I can't wrap my head around how like I was just saying this the other day about like when David Lynch passed away, which I was like. Wrestling, like paranormal stuff, like if I had known that wrestling was going to be as popular as it was today, as it was when I was like a kid and watching it, or even in my teens and 20s when I was watching it, but like watching it because, you know, can't let the girls know, you know, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
But nowadays I see it and it's like so much more just like accepted and become almost mainstream. And it's the same with paranormal stuff. It's like you see just like you were talking about it with Lauren the other day on your other episode, where it's like you go just out to Walmart or something and you see just a Bigfoot, whatever. Just walking around now, you see a Mothman hoodie, or you see a Bigfoot thing, or you just see just everywhere you go. There's just paranormal stuff, ghosts, and crazy. You know, UFOs, all this stuff. Yeah. But it's the same with wrestling, right? So my whole fandom when I was a kid, growing up, we had WWE, we had WCW. Yeah. Nowadays, that's like expanded so much more to where now you have like every state has like their own little indie wrestling organizations going on. And you have like AEW is like a big name brand now that's like not, you know, I mean, we didn't have stuff that much variety in it. And it's because it's becoming more mainstream. And it's like you can go and watch it in your hometown now. And you can also travel and go see it like at the biggest city in some stadium or something like that. And I think that's really cool. And it's also that way with paranormal research, right? Because now we have like things like CryptidCon that are like blows my mind that we have like these like huge conventions and stuff like that we do. But then at the same time, we still have like little like, you know, conventions that we have at like Fort Knox here in town that have like 5 vendors and like, you know, 3 people, like local authors, will come and speak.
Is that the one Lauren was at? The Fort Knox one?
It was one of them, yeah.
Yeah, remember Lauren mentioning that one, yeah.
He's such a good speaker to listen to. Like, anytime that I get an opportunity to see him, like, speak, I always go. And he's done a surprising amount of them just locally to me. It's just little places, just little libraries, or just this random event that's going on and stuff. Yeah. So it's always a joy to get to see him do these things. And the last time that I was supposed to see him was back in 2020. I want to say he was supposed to do it in 2020. And they ended up canceling it with the pandemic. And I haven't been able to see him since. And that was always something that I was like, I know he's like in his 70s now, and I'm sure he does not want to go traveling around doing a ton of conventions and things like that nowadays. So I've always kind of been like, I wish I had gotten to see him that time, because he's the preeminent expert, Yeah. There's nobody else in the field nowadays like it. It's just, it.
Absolutely. So, well, hopefully when they open the museum in Bangor, you'll make the trip. I don't know how far it is for you to Bangor. It's quite a ways for me. It's like 3 hours, but I promised Lauren I'll be up there for the opening of the new museum when they do it.
Well,
hopefully
I'll see you there. Yeah, hopefully I'll see you there, because it's like an hour drive for me, and I'm planning on going as soon as we've got a date for it.
Awesome.
It was such cool news when I heard they were moving that to a better location. I was like, good, because I loved the original one, but if you've been in there and you see, like, he was doing a lot with a very small amount of space for what he
like, for sure.
He was making it work, but now I'm so excited to see what they do with this new location. I'm very happy for him, and it's so cool, because it's like, who else has that, Exactly. Yeah, I'm looking forward to see what they do. What do you watch nowadays for wrestling? Because I'm kind of like you. I grew up on it. I started in '89, so okay, yeah.
Now, like 35 years, I've been watching this fucking shit, which is crazy. And I joke with people that I have guests on. They have this exceptional knowledge of like UFO cases and Bigfoot cases, and they can do it chapter and verse. And I'm like, that's cool and all, but like, I can tell you about the first 10 WrestleManias, like fucking just really like chat, like I'm quoting the fucking Bible, right? Like it's that I have this intense, insane knowledge. Nowadays, I mostly just watch AEW because I kind of like the old school wrestling vibe of it all. And I find the WWE to be so commercialized and slick and flashy and really well done, and I understand why it's enormously popular now, and like, hats off to them for fucking like becoming super huge again. Like, this is like their biggest boom period in 25 years, and it's like good for them, and it's awesome and shit. But I like just the old school wrestling, the blood, the just the shit. So, it's not carefully scripted, and half the time it doesn't make any fucking sense. And it's like, wait a minute, why is he teaming with that guy when he tried to murder his wife? And it's like, they're both bad guys now, and this is wrestling, and they team up. That's how it works. Like,
exactly.
There's no eternal logic. So
honestly,
what do you watch these days?
Well, I agree with everything you just said there, because honestly, that's been like a big sentiment in the last few years with like wrestling in general, honestly, because we have like AEW very much is a throwback. It's more, I guess, what back in the day, for lack of a better term, we used to call real wrestling, right? Because we used to watch like ECW or WCW. We'd be like, this is the real stuff. This is this is like, and while I do appreciate like what WWE does and has contributed to like obviously the business at large, you're right. They have become like, it's all about the presentation. Was the best example was recently they just premiered on their Netflix. Raw, just went to Netflix, right? So their first episode, and this one blew my mind because it's a 2.5 hour broadcast, 4 matches. In a 2.5 hour broadcast, they managed to squeeze out 4 matches. Okay.
Yeah.
That, to me, that sounds insane. Like, I see it, and I get why they're doing it. And even in the context of the business that night, I'm like, I get it. But as a wrestling fan, is it more engaging and better to see that? Or is it better that within the first 30 seconds of the other show, they have one of their top stars on the way out there to have just a half an hour banger match. And
Right. Yeah.
That's the stuff that I'm like, I love that. I eat that
Yeah.
up. That, and honestly, it's like, while there are like specific wrestlers and stuff that are in WWE that I really enjoy, I think the overall like direction of where things are going nowadays, like AEW's format, is becoming better. And even their storytelling, when they do it right or when they do it well,
It's really good. Yeah.
It's really good. Oh man, like I was
like Mariah May, like my girl Mariah May and Tony Storm.
Yep.
Great story.
That was one that I was just blown away. I was like, anybody that's saying that they can't tell stories, I don't know what they're watching, because this has been an ongoing developing story since the moment that they hired her.
Yeah.
This is not something they just threw together in the course of 3 months. They had this plan the moment they signed the fucking contract with this woman.
Yeah, and now it's gone for like a year and a half. And people talk about the bloodline storyline. It's like, hey, come on, dude. These two women have had this fucking year and a half long epic fucking saga that you know,
right,
could stretch for another 6 months or something, knowing them. Who knows? So it's
exactly. And even to compare that is like, you look at the bloodline as the one that they keep like touting, and it's, you know, hey, is it good storytelling? Absolutely. I'd argue it's pretty damn good, because it's a friggin' 4-year-long soap opera that people are still entertained to see each week. You're obviously doing something right if that's the reaction you're getting after 4 years and Roman Reigns comes out and holds up a finger and the fucking audience still blows their heads off. Okay, you have something there, okay? So nobody can really deny that. But then when you look at all the moving parts of the other things that other people are doing, what do you have? Is there anything in WWE right now that is not completely just tied into bloodline stuff as far as real storytelling? Hardly at all. There's a few. There's a couple of stars that I specifically really like. I'm big on horror people. So when they debuted the Wyatt Six in the WWE this year, I lost my damn mind, because like Bray Wyatt was my dude. So when they friggin' bring back a whole faction that is his like brainchild after he passed away, I was like, hell yeah, let's let these people cook. And here it is, 6 months, 8 months later, and we're not even seeing them on TV right now.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, people went crazy when they debuted, and it's like now, and they're like lower mid card guys. It's like, oh, geez, they're not even like in the mix. They're not like feuding with the bloodline and shit or anything. It's like they're kind of just like mediocre dudes. Yeah, it's very interesting. I could talk to you about wrestling for all night, but I know people are listening. People are listening, so they're already like, "What the fuck, man?"
Yeah, but one of these days, you and me just have to have a conversation about that stuff, because I can certainly go on about that shit for a long time.
Yeah. Well, we'll spare the audience. Maybe we can chat after we wrap up the show. So so to steer it back for the half dozen wrestling fans who stuck around through the end of that,
they're gonna love it though. They're gonna be like,
they're gonna be like, oh yeah, they're gonna be like, yeah. I've thought about doing a wrestling podcast, because you would not believe how many guests we've had on the show who are huge wrestling fans. The crossover,
what an overlap, huh?
Insane. Yeah, the crossover is really insane. I'm actually looking at a guy I'm trying to get on. He used to be in the wrestling business, so and I had actually, I'll send you the link, but we had an old time NWA enhancement guy, Cougar J. He was on last year, and it was an interesting conversation, a lot of fun. He wrestled Ric Flair. Flair they used to call them jobbers. He was a jobber against Ric Flair in 1989. Ric Flair's best fucking year, ever. It was like, holy shit, dude. I was like, even on the show, I'm like, you wrestled Ric fucking Flair, dude. Like, I would die a happy man after that. Anyway. Yeah, go ahead.
That's one of those things, man. You hear that, even to hear the year and the name, I'm just like, wow.
Yeah, dude. Can you imagine he shows up at center stage in Atlanta, and they're like, yeah, you're with Flair tonight. It's like, holy shit.
Yeah.
On that note, I can't thank you enough, Reverend Redbeard. It's been an absolute blast chatting with you. I hope that our paths cross in the real world at some point. There's plenty of these events around New England. Hopefully we can meet up sometime for a drink and a chat about all this stuff, and maybe even at Lawrence Museum. But until then, folks can check out your stuff. It's really well done. I like it. It's like creepy. It's got a creepy vibe. It's got, it's like produced really well, folks. And I may drop the teaser that you have in there. I'll stick the teaser in after the
I'd appreciate
thing or
it.
at some point here. But with all that said, I just want to thank you, man. I really had a really fun conversation. People should check it out. Acadia After Dark or Acadia After Dark. And that's it, man. Thank you so much for the fun conversation.
Hey, I thank you so much for having me. It was really cool. I do appreciate you, and I enjoy your work. So, I mean, just keep doing what you do, man. And, you offering a platform to, people to come on and talk. That's always a great thing to see. So keep it up, bud.